All right, listeners, so you sent us a whole bunch of questions about incident management. Looks like someone is getting ready for the CISM exam.
Yeah, those are some really good questions, too. Really gets at the heart of what incident management is all about.
So for this deep dive, we're going to tackle those questions one by one and hopefully give you a little bit more insight into the world of incident management. So let's jump right in. The first question here asks about the role of a SIM in incident management. So what is it and why is it so important?
CIAM, or Security Information and Event Management System. It's like the central nervous system for your security infrastructure. It collects logs and events from all your different security tools, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, antivirus software, all of that, and brings all that data into one place.
Okay, so it's like a giant data aggregator.
Right.
But how does a SIM actually help you manage incidents? Isn't it just a giant haystack of data?
Well, that's where the magic happens. A SIEM doesn't just collect data, it analyzes it too. It correlates events. It looks for patterns that might indicate malicious activity. Think of it like a detective, piecing together clues from different sources. It can spot those subtle anomalies and red flags that you might miss otherwise.
So it's not just about seeing all the data in one place, but it's also about making sense of it and identifying those potential threats early on.
Exactly. And a good SIEM will generate alerts based on predefined rules or threat intelligence feeds. This way, your security team can respond to incidents faster and more effectively.
That's a huge advantage in the world of cybersecurity where every second counts.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on, the next question here asks about incident response capabilities, specifically for organizations with limited resources. So how can an organization that can't afford a full-blown forensic team still get the expertise they need when an incident occurs?
Right. Not every organization has the budget for a dedicated forensic team. But that doesn't mean you have to go without incident response capabilities altogether. One of the best options for smaller organizations is an incident response retainer.
So it's like having an expert on call. You don't need them all the time, but when something happens, they're there to help you navigate the chaos.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you access to specialized skills and tools when you need them most without the overhead of a full-time team.
Makes sense. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about protecting business applications. One of the questions asks how to prioritize protection when you have hundreds of applications and you can't protect everything equally. It's like triage for your IT systems.
You got it. You can't put a fortress around every single application. You have to be
Right.
strategic. That's where a business impact analysis, or BIA, comes in.
And what is that exactly?
Well, a BIA is a systematic process for identifying which applications are most critical to your operations, the ones that would cause the most damage if they went down.
So it's not just about gut feeling. There's a structured way to figure out what needs the most protection.
Absolutely. A BIA helps you assess the potential impact of different disruptions, quantify the risks, and prioritize your efforts.
Right. You want to focus on protecting those crown jewels, the systems that keep the lights on and the money coming in. Speaking of threats that can bring an organization to its knees, let's talk about ransomware. This next question asks about the best data protection strategy against ransomware attacks. So what's the gold standard for keeping those digital hostage takers at bay?
Offline backups. Absolutely offline backups.
Okay.
I can't stress that enough. Cloud replication, secondary storage systems, all that stuff is good to have. But offline backups are really your best bet.
And why is that?
Well, because ransomware is designed to encrypt everything it can get its hands on. If your backups are connected to your network, they're just as vulnerable as everything else.
So it's like keeping a spare key outside your house. You don't have that key hanging right next to the front door where a burglar can find it.
Exactly. Offline backups, completely disconnected from your network. They're like that spare key. They give you a clean copy of your data that you can use to restore your systems without paying the ransom.
So offline backups are like that one thing you really can't skip. All right, well, let's move on. This next question asks about incident response plan testing. Why is testing so important? And what are the different approaches to testing?
You wouldn't wait for a fire to start to test your fire alarm, would you? The same goes for your incident response plan. You got to test it to make sure it actually works when you need it. And there are different levels of testing, each with its own purpose.
Okay, let's hear it. What are the different ways to test your plan?
Well, at the most basic level, there's the document review. You basically just sit down with your team, go through the plan step by step, make sure it's all clear and up to date.
So it's like a sanity check for your plan.
Yeah, exactly. Then you have walkthroughs, where you actually walk through the steps of the plan, simulating different scenarios and discussing how you would respond.
So it's kind of like a dress rehearsal for a play. You're not on stage yet, but you're getting a feel for how things will flow.
Right. And then you have simulations. This is where you actually create a mock incident and have your team respond in real time.
Now we're talking. That sounds like a great way to really put your team and your plan to the test.
It is. Simulations can be incredibly valuable. They can help you identify gaps in your plan areas for improvement and make sure your team is ready for the real deal.
This is all making a lot of sense. Proactive planning and preparation are key. You mentioned something earlier called dwell time, and I have to admit I'm intrigued. What exactly does that refer to in the context of incident management?
Dwell time is the amount of time between when an intrusion occurs and when it's detected. Basically, it's how long an attacker has been lurking in your systems without you knowing it.
So it's like a game of hide and seek, but with much higher stakes.
Exactly. And the longer the dwell time, the more damage an attacker can do. They can steal data plant malware, establish a foothold in your network, all sorts of nasty things.
So minimizing dwell time is all about early detection and rapid response.
Exactly. The faster you can spot an intrusion, the better your chances of containing it and preventing a major breach.
All right, so let's talk about what happens when things escalate beyond the technical realm and legal issues come into play. One of the questions asks about the purpose of attorney-client privilege during an incident investigation. I imagine things can get pretty complicated when lawyers get involved.
You're right. Legal considerations can add a whole new layer of complexity to incident management, and the concept of attorney-client privilege in this context is often misunderstood.
I can see how that could happen. Some people might think it's about hiding evidence or trying to cover something up.
Right, but that's not what it's about at all. Attorney-client privilege during an investigation is about protecting the integrity of the investigation itself. It's about making sure that the organization can get legal advice without fear that that advice will be used against them later on.
So it's about fostering open and honest communication between the organization and its legal team, allowing them to strategize and respond effectively without worrying about jeopardizing their legal position.
Exactly. It's about protecting the legal strategy, not about concealing wrongdoing.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Now, another question asks about the importance of chain of custody procedures. Why is it so crucial to maintain a clear chain of custody for evidence?
Chain of custody is all about ensuring the integrity and admissibility of evidence. It's about documenting who handled the evidence, when, and for what purpose. Creating a clear and unbroken chain from the moment it's collected to the point when it's presented in court.
So it's like a tamper-proof seal on the evidence, guaranteeing that it hasn't been altered or compromised.
Exactly. And this is important not only for legal proceedings, but also for your own internal investigations. You need to be able to trust the evidence you're using to make decisions.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about business continuity planning. One of the questions focuses on an organization that has just developed its first business continuity plan. So what's the logical first step they should take once they have that plan in place?
A walkthrough, absolutely. It's the best way to familiarize everyone with the plan, identify any potential issues, and make sure everyone knows their roles.
So it's like a test run before the real deal.
Exactly. Even though it's a low-stakes exercise, a walkthrough can be incredibly valuable in helping you refine your plan and make sure it's ready for a real crisis.
That makes a lot of sense. You definitely don't want to wait until a disaster strikes to find out that your plan has holes in it. Now, speaking of disasters, one of the questions asks about what to do when a ransomware attack hits critical data. It's not just a theoretical threat anymore. It's a real-world nightmare that many organizations are facing today. So what's the best course of action in that situation?
Well, you need to activate both your security incident response plan and your business continuity plan. It's not in either situation. You need to do both simultaneously.
So it's like a two-pronged attack against the crisis. You're trying to contain the ransomware attack while also working to restore critical functions.
Exactly. The security incident response team is focused on isolating infected systems, preventing the spread of the malware, and hopefully recovering any encrypted data if possible. At the same time, the business continuity team is kicking into gear using backups and alternative systems to bring essential functions back online as quickly as possible.
It sounds like a carefully choreographed dance between two teams, each with their own specialized skills.
It is, and communication is key during this whole process. Keeping everyone informed, from senior management to employees to customers, can make a world of difference in maintaining trust and ensuring a smoother recovery.
Speaking of recovery, let's talk about hot sites.
Yeah.
One of the questions asks about the most important consideration when choosing a hot site for disaster recovery. So what's the key factor that organizations should keep in mind?
Location, location, location. The most important factor is the geographic location of the hot site in relation to your primary site. You want it to be far enough away that it's unlikely to be affected by the same disaster that took down your primary operations.
So if a hurricane takes out your data center, you don't want your hot site to be just down the street.
Right. Geographic diversity is key. You want to spread the risk and make sure your backup site isn't vulnerable to the same threats that could impact your primary location.
All right, so let's talk about recovery point objectives, or RPOs. One of the questions asks about an organization with a 14-day RPO for its most critical applications. So what does that mean in practical terms, and what kind of recovery strategy would be appropriate in that scenario?
A 14-day RPO means they're willing to accept the loss of up to 14 days worth of data for those applications. So they're not aiming for zero data loss, which gives them some flexibility in terms of recovery strategies.
So what kind of recovery site would make sense for an organization with a 14-day RPO?
In this case, a warm site might be a good option. It offers a balance between cost and recovery time. It's not as expensive as a hot site, but it still allows for a reasonably quick recovery.
So it's a compromise between cost and recovery speed. And with a 14-day RPO, they have a little bit of breathing room.
Exactly. It's all about finding that sweet spot between cost recovery time and acceptable data loss based on the organization's specific needs and risk tolerance.
All right, let's talk about another technology that can play a key role in maintaining continuous operations: server clustering. One of the questions asks how server clustering technology can ensure continuous service to users, even if one server in the cluster fails. So it's like having a built-in safety net for your IT infrastructure.
That's a great way to put it. Server clustering is all about redundancy and failover. If one server crashes, the others automatically pick up the slack, ensuring that users experience little to no interruption in service.
It's like having an understudy ready to step in at a moment's notice if the lead actor can't perform. The show must go on.
Precisely. Server clustering is all about minimizing downtime and keeping those critical applications running smoothly, even when hardware failures occur.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from CISMs and ransomware protection to business continuity planning and server clustering.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the basics for a minute. One of the questions asks why storing backup media offsite is so important. It seems like a simple concept, but it's one that a lot of organizations still overlook. Why is that so crucial?
It's all about not putting all your eggs in one basket. You don't want your backups to be in the same location as your primary systems. What if there's a fire or a flood or some other disaster that wipes out your data center? If your backups are stored there too, they're gone as well.
So it's like having an insurance policy for your data.
Exactly. Off-site backups are your protection against total data loss. They give you a way to recover even in the worst-case scenario.
Now let's end this first part of our deep dive with a scenario that really puts things in perspective. One of the questions asks about the immediate aftermath of a major earthquake hitting an organization's operations center. It's a chaotic and potentially dangerous situation. So what should be the absolute top priority in those first few critical moments?
The safety of your people, no question about it. Everything else, data recovery system, restoration, all of that can wait. Human life comes first, always.
That's a powerful reminder that incident management is not just about technical procedures, it's about people and making the right decisions in the face of adversity.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll continue to explore as we dive into the remaining questions in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, listeners, for part 2 of our incident management adventure. We'll be back shortly to tackle even more of your insightful questions and unpack some more of the critical concepts that can help you become a true incident response pro. Welcome back, listeners. We're picking up right where we left off with all your great questions about incident management.
Yeah, we're going to get into some really interesting stuff now, some real-world scenarios that can really put your incident management skills to the test.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the questions we got asks about what happens when you're facing a ransomware attack that's actively encrypting or damaging critical data. It's not just a theoretical what if anymore. This is a real nightmare scenario that a lot of organizations are facing these days.
Right, and like we talked about earlier, the best approach here is to activate both your security incident response plan and your business continuity plan. At the same time, you got to hit it from both sides.
So you're basically running two plays at the same time. You've got one team trying to contain the ransomware and prevent further damage, and another team trying to get those essential systems back online as quickly as possible.
That's the idea. You want to minimize both the immediate impact of the attack and the long-term disruption to the business. And remember, communication is key throughout this whole process. You got to keep everyone informed, from senior management to employees to customers. Everyone needs to know what's going on and what's being done about it.
Now, speaking of recovery, let's talk about hot sites. One of the questions we got asked about the most important thing to consider when choosing a hot site for disaster recovery. What's the one thing that organizations should absolutely prioritize?
It's all about location, the geographic location of the hot site in relation to your main site. That's the most critical factor. You want to make sure that hot site is far enough away that it's not going to be affected by the same event that took down your primary operations.
So if a hurricane takes out your data center, you don't want your hot site to be right next door.
Exactly. Geographic diversity is key. You got to spread the risk and make sure your backup site isn't vulnerable to the same earthquake, flood, or whatever else might happen to your primary location.
So hot sites are all about having that safety net in place,
Yeah.
but they're not the only option.
Right.
There are also warm sites and cold sites. So how do you decide which type of recovery site is the right fit for your organization?
Well, it depends on your recovery objectives, your tolerance for downtime, and of course your budget. One of the questions we got asks about an organization with a 14-day RPO for their most critical applications. So what kind of recovery strategy would make sense in that scenario?
So just to clarify, a 14-day RPO means they're okay with potentially losing up to 14 days worth of data for those applications, right?
Right, so they don't need an instantaneous recovery like you'd get with a hot site, which gives them a little more flexibility in terms of cost and recovery options.
So what kind of recovery site would make sense in that case?
Well, a warm site could be a good fit in this situation. It's kind of a middle ground between a hot site and a cold site. It has some equipment and infrastructure in place, but it might take a bit longer to get everything up and running compared to a hot site.
So it's a compromise between cost and recovery speed. And with a 14-day RPO, it sounds like a warm site could give them the balance they need.
Exactly. It all comes down to finding that sweet spot between how much data you can afford to lose, how quickly you need to recover, and how much you're willing to spend.
Now let's talk about another technology that can help you keep those critical systems up and running: server clustering. One of the questions asks about how server clustering can ensure continuous service to users, even if one of the servers in the cluster fails. It's like having a built-in redundancy system, right?
That's a great way to put it. Server clustering is all about redundancy and failover. If one server crashes, the others automatically pick up the slack so users don't even notice the interruption.
It's like having an understudy ready to step in if the lead actor breaks a leg.
Exactly. The show must go on, and server clustering helps make sure that happens with minimal disruption to your users.
So it's a great way to proactively prevent downtime and keep those critical applications running smoothly. Now, we've talked about a lot of pretty high-tech solutions,
Well,
but let's not forget about one of the most fundamental aspects of disaster recovery: backups. One of the questions we got asks why storing backup media offsite is so important. It seems like a pretty basic concept, but it's one that a lot of organizations still struggle with.
You're right, and it really comes down to one simple principle. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. You need to have a copy of your data stored somewhere, safe and separate from your primary systems, just in case something happens.
So it's like having an escape route for your data, a safe haven where it can weather the storm.
Exactly. If a fire or a flood or some other disaster wipes out your primary data center, you need to know that you have a backup copy somewhere else that you can use to recover.
So offsite backups are essential. They're your insurance policy against total data loss. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the human side of incident management. One of the questions we get asked about what happens immediately after a major earthquake hits an organization's operations center. It's a chaotic and potentially dangerous situation. So what should be the absolute top priority in those first few minutes?
Wait, the safety of your people, no question about it. Everything else takes a backseat to making sure everyone is safe and accounted for. That's the first and most important thing you need to focus on.
That's a really important point, and it highlights the fact that incident management is about more than just technology and processes. It's about people and leadership and making the right decisions under pressure.
You got it. And we're going to talk more about that as we dive into the final set of questions in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, listeners, for part 3 of our incident management journey. We'll be back shortly to wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts and insights that can help you build a more resilient and secure organization. All right, listeners, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive on incident management. We've talked about a lot of stuff already, so let's wrap things up with those last few questions you sent in.
Yeah, these questions really get to the heart of what it means to be prepared for anything, thinking ahead and having a plan for when things go wrong.
Okay, so one of the questions asks about the chain of custody procedures. Why is it so important to keep track of who's handled the evidence during an investigation?
Well, think about it. If you're going to use that evidence to make decisions or take action, you need to be absolutely sure that it's legitimate, that nobody's tampered with it. The chain of custody is all about maintaining that integrity.
So it's like a paper trail for the evidence itself, making sure it's all accounted for and that there's no room for doubt.
Exactly. It's crucial for legal proceedings, of course, but it's also important for your own internal investigations. You need to be able to trust the evidence you're working with.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about something that often gets a little murky, attorney-client privilege during an investigation. One of the questions asks about the purpose of this privilege, and I think it's important to clear up any misconceptions people might have.
Yeah, a lot of people think it's about hiding something or covering up wrongdoing, but that's not what it's about at all. Attorney-client privilege during an investigation is about protecting the organization's ability to get legal advice without fear of that advice being used against them.
So it's about creating a safe space for open and honest communication between the organization and its lawyers so they can figure out the best way to respond to this situation.
Exactly. It's about protecting the legal strategy, not about hiding the truth.
All right, well, that clears that up. So let's move on to another question. This one is about business continuity planning, specifically. It asks what an organization should do after they've developed their first business continuity plan. What's the next logical step?
Well, the first thing you should do is walk through the plan with your team. It's a great way to make sure everyone understands their roles and responsibilities and to identify any potential gaps or issues before a real crisis hits.
So it's kind of like a dry run, a chance to practice and make sure everything flows smoothly.
Exactly. You want to make sure your plan is actually workable and that everyone knows what to do when the time comes.
Speaking of being ready for anything, one of the questions asks about what to do immediately after a major earthquake hits your operations center. It's a pretty intense scenario. What should be your top priority in those first few minutes?
The safety of your people, hands down everything else, data systems, all that stuff can wait. The most important thing is to make sure everyone is safe and accounted for.
That's a good reminder that incident management is about people, first and foremost. It's about protecting lives and making sure everyone is taken care of.
You got it. Now, one more question before we wrap things up. This one asks about how server clustering can help ensure continuous service to users, even if one of the servers in the cluster fails. It's a good example of how technology can help you build resilience into your systems, right?
Yeah, it's like having a backup generator that kicks in automatically if the power goes out.
Exactly. Server clustering is all about redundancy and failover. If one server goes down, the others pick up the slack, and users don't even notice the interruption.
So it's a great way to minimize downtime and keep those critical applications running smoothly.
It is, and it's a good reminder that incident management isn't just about reacting to things. It's also about being proactive and putting systems in place to prevent problems in the first place.
Well said.
Yeah.
So there you have it, listener. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive on incident management, from the technical aspects of SIMs and ransomware protection to the human side of disaster recovery and the importance of communication and planning.
Hopefully you've gained some valuable insights that you can apply in your own organization, whether you're a seasoned security professional or just starting out in the field.
Remember, incident management is an ongoing process. It's not something you do once and then forget about it. It's about constantly evaluating your risks, testing your plans, and making sure you're prepared for whatever comes your way.
And never stop learning. The world of cybersecurity is always evolving, so stay curious, keep asking questions, and always strive to improve your skills.
That's great advice. Well, listener, that brings us to the end of our deep dive on incident management. We hope you found it informative and engaging. As always, we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time.